Thank you. Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here today. Hannes Holmstedt, the man we are honoring, was among my first and best students ever, and after graduation he remained a very loyal and good friend. I think a lot of people know him as such. I congratulate him on his recent birthday and wish him all the best for the future. I have entitled this lecture, When Iceland Paved the Way for the United States into the Battle of the Atlantic, 1941. In March 1941, the US Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, providing for massive aid to Britain. However, the aid would obviously be of little value if the arms shipments ended up at the bottom of the sea. The German submarine fleet had extended its operations all the way to the west, to the waters of Greenland, and the British were suffering serious reversals in Greece and North Africa. In the spring, Winston Churchill urgently appealed to President Roosevelt to order the US Navy to start escorting Atlantic convoys across the ocean and to replace the British garrison in Iceland. Obviously, the objective was to engage the United States in the struggle in the North Atlantic. In May 1941, Roosevelt suddenly agreed to Churchill's request on Iceland. During the presidential election campaign of 1940, he had pledged to keep America out of the European war in accordance with the public mood. Now he therefore needed to formally proceed in line with traditional American policy defending the so-called Western Hemisphere in the name of the 19th century Monroe Doctrine, which aimed at preventing European interference in Latin America, while America would refrain from interfering in European affairs. The US Neutrality Act, introduced at the beginning of World War II, stipulated that American ships were prohibited to enter the so-called combat zone in the Atlantic, but its limits had been drawn east of Iceland, although the eastern limits of the Western Hemisphere had been set in Greenland in 1918. However, by taking over the defense of Iceland from the British, the President would have a legitimate reason to order the US Navy to protect shipping as far as a US outpost in Iceland. The Western Hemisphere would in effect be extended from Greenland to Iceland. German attacks would give the President the necessary justification for the final step, transatlantic escorting, without any formal declaration of war on either side. The Foreign Office in London now suggested that President Roosevelt should simply relieve the British garrison in Iceland without seeking the consent of the national government in Reykjavik. The President, however, rejected this suggestion as entirely unacceptable on various grounds. Needless to say, Roosevelt was presenting himself as a leader of the free world and could not possibly occupy a tiny, neutral democracy with armed force without hurting the interest of his government at home and abroad. Moreover, the President was convinced that the Icelandic government was waiting with open arms to welcome US troops to Iceland. Confident of such welcoming, a convoy of American transport ships carrying a brigade of US Marines set to sail for Iceland via Newfoundland on the 22nd of June 1941, one day after Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. 2 days later, the British minister in Reykjavik, Charles Howard Smith, informed Prime Minister Hermann Jónasson that the British Army Division in Iceland was required elsewhere, but the United States was prepared to take over the defense of the country upon invitation. I am instructed, Smith said, to press you to accept this proposal, which can bring you nothing but advantage. The Icelandic Prime Minister replied that he was personally opposed to requesting American protection, and that a secret parliamentary discussion had recently revealed that the majority of MPs shared his view. When the Prime Minister's reply reached the Foreign Office in London, there was an uproar in Whitehall. The Foreign Office ordered Smith immediately not to hesitate to use a certain amount of brutal frankness. Foreign Minister Anthony Eden told Smith that his mission in Iceland was absolutely vital. It could have a decisive effect on the course of the war. In the meantime, the Icelandic government had met, and as it turned out, not a single minister shared the Prime Minister's opinion. On the other hand, all the ministers agreed that they could not possibly exceed the government's constitutional mandate, which belonged to the Althing, and directly request U.S. military protection for Iceland having declared eternal neutrality upon gaining sovereignty from Denmark in 1918. You probably all know the theory that individuals do not count in relations of states. British Minister Howard Smith, a highly intelligent and competent diplomat, much admired and trusted by Icelanders, realized what was needed to solve this crisis. That is, to formulate an Icelandic message to President Roosevelt tantamount to an invitation of American forces to Iceland, but ambiguous enough for the government to be able to maintain that it had only consented to such to American protection. Smith knew that the government was ready to do everything that it could reasonably to pave the way for U.S. intervention in the Battle of the Atlantic on the side of Iceland's old protector, Great Britain. Smith had an important ally and friend in Iceland, the newly elected regent, later the first president of Iceland, Sveinn Björnsson, the country's most seasoned diplomat and an old legal brain. Both men had served their countries in Copenhagen up to the German occupation. They now joined together in drafting a suitable formula for a message to President Roosevelt, which was unanimously agreed to by the government. But that was not the end of the story, rather the beginning. The government had composed a long list of conditions for accepting U.S. protection, not only addressed to the United States, but also to Britain. The brain behind these conditions was Bjarni Benediktsson, then mayor of Reykjavik, and later foreign minister and prime minister, who paved the way for Icelandic participation in NATO and Western cooperation. These conditions became the essence of the Icelandic-US Defense Agreement of June 1941. The theory of the tyranny of the weak was being proved, not for the last time in Icelandic foreign relations. But I'm speaking metaphorically because President Roosevelt was most favorably disposed towards Icelanders and was quite inclined to meet their wishes as far as he could. I have described the government's conditions for the agreement as an extraordinary and highly successful attempt to solve all the major problems that Iceland had faced from the beginning of the Great Depression of the 1930s, exacerbated by the threat posed by Nazi Germany and outbreak of war. By accepting the Icelandic condition, the United States committed itself to the following: A, strongest defense of the country possible, including air defense, of which the U.S. was woefully short, as brought out at Pearl Harbor a few months later, when a fighter squadron, which should ideally have been protecting the U.S. fleet there, was resting at Reykjavik airfield. An example of what Roosevelt was willing to do. B, maximum consideration to civilian safety in all defenses. E, full support of Icelandic foreign trade and shipping together with Britain, favorable trade agreement on a permanent basis. D, safeguard in future peace treaty the absolute independence and sovereignty of Iceland. E, abstain from any interference in Icelandic affairs and any intrusion in Icelandic culture and society. This clause was especially designed to prevent relationship between Icelandic women and US troops, which had been the greatest thorn in the relations with the British forces, and included a secret clause forbidding the US to send any black servicemen to the country. F, to withdraw all forces from Iceland at the end of the war. G, to further the interest of Iceland in every way, a commitment, I think, which is quite unparalleled in agreement between states. Now the consequences. Iceland was duly protected from German invasion and major attacks. She enjoyed the greatest prosperity of any European country for the rest of the war, became an independent republic in 1944 with full US support, and laid the groundwork for a lasting and beneficial defense and economic relationship with the United States. Roosevelt and Churchill both met their strategic objectives. The US Navy started escorting ships to Iceland, leading to repeated engagement with German U-boats. At the Atlantic Conference of August 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill in Newfoundland agreed on a plan whereby the US Navy should undertake escorting responsibility to a point south of Iceland. The United States had joined the Battle of the Atlantic on the side of Britain. Churchill's return from the conference via visit to Iceland with President Roosevelt's son, a naval lieutenant, on his side, brought the Anglo-American Accord to a triumphant conclusion at the first joint US-British military parade in Reykjavik. No wonder that a cheerful Churchill gave the V sign as he left Reykjavik harbor amidst a thunderous farewell from ships in the harbor and a huge crowd of Icelanders waving goodbye. Thank you.